Worship keys players know they need great warm pads, but you might not know how to make one. In today's tutorial, I'm going to teach you how to design your own warm worship pad sound from scratch. Let's check it out. Hi folks, I'm David from SundaySounds.com, where our focus is empowering worship keys players and leaders to bring awesome worship keys sounds to their worship band in MainStage or Ableton Live. Today we're going to be talking about warm pads. In this tutorial, I'm going to teach you how you can design a warm pad for yourself. And I'm going to do it in a generic way so you can follow along no matter what plugin or software you use for your live performances. I'd encourage you to consider subscribing to the channel because we put out a new worship keys video every single week to help you level up the keys position at your church. All right, let's dive right in. I'm going to teach you how to make a warm pad. First, I want to talk about what a warm pad even is, and really even more than that, why do you need a warm pad sound? So I've got this example warm pad patch. This is a preset from our Sunday Keys template called the Silky Velo Strings. This is a string pad sound that's really nice and warm. And we can use pads for a number of different purposes, but there are a few most common use cases that I want to identify because they're going to inform all of the choices we make as we design this pad sound. So first off, I'm going to just combine this pad with a piano from Sunday Keys. So I've got the balanced version of the Sunday Grand. So together, these two layers sound like this. This is a classic piano and pad layered patch. So in this sort of context, we're using the pad to do a few things, to sort of extend and smooth out the sound of the piano and really just glue everything together. The pad is not standing out on top and it has way less attack than the piano. It's just sort of sitting underneath and bringing the piano sound not down, but sort of smoothing it out, spreading it out, and really enhancing it. Of course, a pad could sit underneath any lead instrument in the mix. It doesn't have to be a piano. It could be acoustic guitar, it could be the electric guitar, or a different synth sound or piano sound that you're using. The important thing is that we can use pads in this instance to sort of extend, enhance, and smooth everything out, functioning as the glue. Now, there's another way that we can use pads, and this is to add a sense of dynamic, a sense of lift. So I'm going to add attack to this pad. I'm going to increase the brightness. And here it's actually sort of standing right alongside of the piano and still enhancing, but also providing some lift and some energy. This is still a warm pad sound, but I'm adding some brightness and some attack to it. So before you can really get to that second use case, you have to start off with a strong, foundational, warm pad. And that's what we're going to be building in today's tutorial. So now let's dive into the software and I'm going to walk through this process step by step. I am going to be working inside of MainStage 3 today. I have our Sunday Keys template open, but I'm going to be using all stock plugins, sounds, and effects for this portion of the video. So if you're a MainStage user, you can follow directly along. If you're an Ableton Live or an Omnisphere user, or even if you have a hardware keyboard that has a synthesizer section, you're going to also be able to follow along. I'm going to make sure that all the principles and concepts I talk about are generic. Today, I've chosen to use ES2, which is a digitally modeling synthesizer. So it's voice to sound, somewhat like an analog synth, but all of the oscillators, everything is digitally generated within the plugin. So to start off with, I want to keep things really simple because we're going to talk about the very basic building blocks of what makes a pad sound be described as warm. So right now I just have oscillator 1 open and it's a square wave and it sounds like this. So you've got a good bit of high frequency content here. And I'm going to go ahead and open up an EQ plugin as well, just so that you can see these two things side by side. So here on screen, we can see lots of content down in the low mids. decent amount in the upper mids, and then that sizzle up here above 5K. Now, when we're talking about warm pads, it's important to think about the human ear. Obviously, audio doesn't have a temperature, so when we talk about warm, we're really talking about the climate or the feeling that the pad evokes. So when I think about warmth, I think about that sort of just right feeling. When you walk into a room and it's pleasantly warm, you don't really notice. If you walk into a room and it's freezing cold, you notice it first thing. When we're talking about a warm pad, that's really what I think the terminology is alluding to, that sense of, this is just right. It's sort of filling the room in a really pleasant way, setting the atmosphere without getting in the way of anything else. So when we talk about warmth in terms of audio, that just right space has to translate to a frequency range, right? So most human speaking voices fall right around here between 100 and maybe 300 hertz. That's the fundamental between a male, a female voice, somewhere in that range. But all of the clarity, all of the presence of the human voice, especially a singing voice, is actually in the harmonic content above that fundamental speaking range. So that's up here in the upper mids, from 500 all the way up to 2K or 3K hertz is really where the clarity and the presence of a vocal resides. And that's actually true of really any instrument, not just the instrument of the human voice. A lot of the clarity, a lot of the note definition, the character that makes a guitar sound like a guitar and a piano sound like a piano, a lot of that's defined up here in these upper mid frequencies, even getting up into the higher frequencies. So when we think about this warm feeling that we're trying to evoke, it needs to sit underneath where that presence and clarity is. And I think that's really what warm is getting at. It's this space where the human voice is sort of residing on a base fundamental level, but then all of the clarity and presence is happening on top. So if we can find a way to dial our pad sounds in so they do sort of highlight this maybe 100 to 300 or 400 hertz range, then that's a really safe starting point for thinking about whether a sound or a pad could be described as warm. So to start off with, there's a couple of ways that we can do this. We can roll off the highs inside of the synthesizer plugin. So here I've got cutoff 2 here. This is all the way open right now. But I can bring this down, and we can see the highs sort of disappearing here in the EQ. So definitely doesn't sound as bright or as sizzly. You might describe that as hot if we wanted to stick with the temperature analogy. But does it sound warm? I don't think so yet. I mean, it sounds darker. Nevertheless, this is a good place to start. Alternatively, we could do this inside of EQ, so I could open this filter back up and then I could turn on high and low pass filters in the EQ. And we could be more aggressive with this if we wanted. Bring that down even more. Notice I've also got a high pass filter turned on here to take out some of that low end rumble. I just want to demonstrate that dialing in the frequency range alone is not enough most of the time to create a pad that could be described as warm. We're definitely closer with this than we were without any processing done to that square wave at all. But we've still got a ways to go. So for now, let's leave this EQ in place here. Okay, so now that we have a target frequency in mind, we need to do something to make this pad more interesting. One of the most common ways that you can achieve a sense of warmth is this gentle sort of movement, this sense of motion or animation. And there's a ton of different ways that you can add motion to a pad sound. Typically, it's going to involve modulation of some sort, and that just means something moving or being changed over a certain period of time. That could happen once, or it could happen over and over repeatedly. So there's a ton of different ways to do this. You can modulate the volume, you can modulate the brightness or the filter cutoff, you can modulate the pitch, you can modulate the oscillator itself. Really quickly, I'm going to show a couple different techniques that can get you some of this gentle sort of motion or animation. Now I'm going to rattle through these really quickly. You can pause the video and replicate the settings that you would like to try out for yourself, or you can come back and watch this section again to get a little bit more information on it. But I'm going to go through these really, really fast here just to give you a few starting points. So first off, in most plugins, you're going to be able to turn on a unison mode. This is going to add a slightly detuned clone of each voice separated out in the stereo field. So without unison on here in ES2, it sounds like this. With unison on, it sounds like this. So it's widening things out, it's spreading things out. And then as I increase this analog knob, those unison voices get further detuned away from each other. So adding that little bit of detuning, that little bit of swirl between the two, in one way or another, to me, translate as a little bit warmer. So we're going to turn this off for now. Another way to do this is by using a technique called pulse width modulation. This is a really popular classic technique for getting great pad sounds. So we're going to start off with this square oscillator. I've already set up here in the modulation section of ES2 a little bit of wave modulation here via LFO2. So every 1.06 hertz, the wave shape is going to be modulated this amount. So that sounds like this. And we can increase or decrease the speed. I'll turn it off so you can compare. Now let's take this a little bit further. I'm going to turn on oscillator 2, which is also set to a square wave. And then I've got another modulation routing set up, which is modulating the wave shape of this oscillator via LFO1, which is set to a much slower and different rate. So you can hear the difference here is just oscillator 1 and just oscillator 2. Two together. Okay, so let's combine these first two methodologies now. I could turn unison back on and increase the amount of analog, and now we're getting into a lot of modulation, a lot of swirl happening. We've got this EQ here helping out with the highs. We could bring the cut amount down here inside the plugin as well. Okay, so now I think we're really getting somewhere. A couple other ways that you could do this. You could actually modulate via an audio effect. So I've got a chorus plugin here. Lots of different ways to get this sort of motion, but the big picture idea here is that you're changing the sound in subtle ways to sort of spread everything around, and that sense of space really helps dial in that this frequency spectrum alone is not enough to get you to a warm pad, but having the right frequencies accented and something interesting sort of happening underneath everything else in the mix is a big part of dialing in a great warm pad sound. Okay, so now that we've talked about motion or modulation and we've talked about the frequency spectrum, let's talk about washing everything out with a little bit of ambience. Now, when you think about ambience, oftentimes in the worship keys world, we immediately go to reverb, and that's a great place to start. It's a cliche for a reason. So let's go ahead and open up this reverb instance. I'm using the Silververb plugin inside of MainStage. You can use the reverb plugin in Ableton Live to get identical sounding results. So here's with some reverb thrown on. So I've got a pretty big reverb sound here with a long decay time, a big size to the reverb itself, and lots of reflectivity in the diffusions. I've also got some pitch modulation going on here inside of the reverb decay itself. I can turn that off and get a much simpler reverb sound that's also really nice. It's just a different flavor. So here's with the modulation on. We can also experiment with bringing down the amount of the dry signal and increasing the wet amount. But you have to be careful here that you're not losing too much of the original signal, because one thing that you really need to watch out for when you're adding ambience is that things aren't getting too muddy or too washed out to where you don't actually have control over the sound any longer. So this might be a little bit much for many use cases. So I'm going to bring this wet amount back down, bring that back up. Now, you're not limited to just using reverb to spatialize or add ambience to a sound. One of my favorite techniques for adding that to a pad is actually to use a delay in place of a reverb, especially if you've got a quicker subdivision and some stereo separation between the delay repeats. So I'm using a stereo delay here inside of MainStage. There is a similar plugin in Ableton Live that you can exactly replicate these settings again. So if you want to pause the video and replicate these settings in whatever DAW you're using, you totally can. The reason that I like doing this, adding some space with a delay plugin, is that the initial attack of the pad is going to be caught by that delay and sort of accented. And then as the pad sustains, you're really not going to notice that delay again for the duration of the rest of that sound. So it can add a little bit of extra space specifically to the beginning of a pad sound, which is really a cool effect. So it sounds like this. And I'll release so you can hear what it's doing. So it's a pretty subtle mix, and also notice that I'm using the tone controls within the delay plugin to really only allow the higher frequencies through. If I were to bring these down to sort of that warm sweet spot, it would be a totally different effect. And whether that's something you want or something you want to avoid is really dictated by the kind of sound that you're going for. So I think that's kind of cool. It's adding a little extra body, and then I'm going to bring this reverb instance back in here. Okay, I think this pad is sounding really nice. I want to talk about one more important thing before we sort of dial this pad in its final version, and that is adding a little bit of compression to the pad. Because when we have all of this motion, all of this modulation happening in the sound, there's going to be a lot of peaks and valleys in the signal because the waves are modulating and you're getting some of them hitting each other at different times and adding together or canceling each other out. But when we're thinking about how we want this pad to be sort of the glue underneath everything, having a little bit more of a stable, reliable signal is really, really helpful. So adding a little bit of basic compression can go a long way to smoothing out your pads. So again, you can pause the video and check out these settings if you'd like to replicate them. But it's pretty basic, subtle compression, just 2-to-1, pretty quick attack, pretty quick release time. It's not adding a bunch of volume, it's not squashing things down too much, it's just smoothing out those peaks. So this is with the compressor off. It's not crazy out of control, but when we bring this compressor in, it does add that little bit of glue. Okay, so I think we've got a really great start here on this pad sound, and you might be thinking, why haven't you talked about the attack time or the release time yet? I've intentionally left that out until this point because in my opinion, the attack and release times that you set inside of your instrument plugin are super important to think about specific to the song that you are going to be using the pad for, even down to the difference between a fast song and a slow song meriting different attack and release times. So if you're not familiar, the attack time is the amount of time it takes for the sound to fade in, and the release time is the amount of time that it takes the pad to fade out after the notes or the sustain pedal is released. And as a basic rule, it's a good idea to think of these things as sort of working in unison. As attack time goes up, oftentimes release time can go up as well. And vice versa. So if you're playing fast lead parts in your right hand and you want that pad to follow along, you're going to need pretty short attack and release times. So here inside of ES2, we can make some adjustments to the attack and release time. We can bring this up to just about a second of attack time. This is sort of in that sort of string pad sort of space where it happens pretty quickly. I'm going to bring this reverb amount down a little bit so it's not hanging on quite so long. One of the reasons I like to do attack and release at the very end is because if I have any wet audio effects like delay or reverb in the signal, that's going to impact the perceived release time or decay time of the sound as well. I could have the release time set to very, very short, but if I've got a bunch of reverb or delay on a signal, to the listener, it's going to feel like a long release time. Now, this is fading in pretty quickly, but it doesn't have necessarily a sense of attack. We could bring this up a lot more and make it fade in much more slowly. And then let's test this out. Let's bring up the release time to sort of match. So now there's this really gradual crossfade between the chords as I play them. Now, depending on the voicing, depending on the song, depending on what else is going on, this might be way too long. It might be way too messy sounding. Now, there's all sorts of things that we can do to make this more flexible. We could add some modulation of the filter cutoff so that that filter cutoff actually sweeps in as well. That's what this looks like. Or we could make the initial attack time or the brightness of the sound respond to the velocity at which we play, so that as we play with greater and greater dynamics, the sound gets brighter or perhaps enters more quickly. All sorts of things you can do to make the patch more usable for live performance or more expressive. Other times you want the pad to be super basic. Maybe you don't want it to respond to velocity much at all, other than just getting a little bit louder as you play with more intensity. Just think about how you want to dial in the sound as a performance instrument to give you the right amount of expression for the song or the set list that you're designing it for. So we've designed this basic warm pad sound, and it's just one flavor. I'm going to put a download link in the description because we're going to give this patch away. We're going to add it to our free Patch of the Week archive, which is a huge archive of hundreds of worship patches that we've released for MainStage and a bunch in Ableton Live formats as well. So if you sign up for our newsletter via the link in the description, you'll immediately get sent a link to the archive and you'll be able to download this patch right now. Now, I want to give you a few different examples really quickly of different flavors of pads that you could fit in that sort of warm pad space. So there's 4 more different flavors of warm pads that you can keep in mind as you start exploring and designing pads of your own. Now, those 4 warm pads were all a part of our Sunday Keys template, which is our done-for-you worship keys resource for MainStage and Ableton Live users. If you'd like a simple overview of how you might be able to use Sunday Keys, we'll put a link in the description. If you're an Ableton Live user or a MainStage user, it's a great way to get some amazing worship keys sounds and a super usable workflow for how you design your own layered worship patches. So there will be a link in the description to Sunday Keys if you'd like to check that out for yourself. Okay, folks, so I hope that this video has helped you understand how you can approach designing a warm pad of your own. Hope it's given you a few ideas. If you found this video helpful, we'd really appreciate it if you'd click the like button, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and let us know if you have questions or comments about how you like to approach creating your own warm pads. Follow the link in the description to download the patch that we designed in this video, along with a bunch of other free worship patches, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.